In the 1940s, a young man named Eugene Gilbert made an observation that would reshape American culture forever. As a teenager himself, Gilbert noticed that his peers had money to spend but weren't being targeted by advertisers. He started conducting informal surveys of his classmates about their shopping habits and preferences, discovering an untapped market that businesses were completely ignoring. Gilbert convinced local retailers to advertise directly to teens, and sales exploded. What Gilbert had stumbled onto wasn't just a business opportunity. He had discovered that an entire demographic could be identified, targeted, and sold to in revolutionary new ways. The teenager, as a distinct consumer category, was about to be born through the power of marketing. But this story isn't about adolescence itself. Humans have always experienced that awkward transition between childhood and adulthood. We're looking at something much more specific, the cultural construct of the teenager as a distinct identity, complete with its own fashion, music, attitudes, and most importantly, its own purchasing power. The word teenager existed before the 1940s, but it was Gilbert's generation that transformed it into a powerful marketing category. And the rebellious teenager, the leather jacket-wearing, authority-defying, rock and roll-loving archetype that still dominates our imagination, that was perhaps the most successful marketing campaign of the 20th century. Here's why this story matters. Understanding how teen rebellion was commercialized shows us how consumer culture shapes identity itself. We think we're watching authentic youth expression, but we're actually witnessing one of the most sophisticated examples of manufactured desire in human history. This changed more than just advertising. It touches on how we understand authenticity, rebellion, and even the nature of growing up in a consumer society. To understand how teen rebellion was invented, we need to start with what came before. In the 1930s and early 1940s, the extended adolescence we know today was largely a privilege of the wealthy. For most young Americans, there was a much shorter gap between childhood and adulthood. Boys might leave school at 14 to work in factories. Girls often married in their late teens. The concept of an extended period of semi-independence, where young people had both free time and disposable income, existed but wasn't widespread. World War II changed everything, but not in the way you might expect. While millions of young men shipped overseas, those who remained at home, both male and female, found themselves with unprecedented economic opportunities. Factories desperate for workers hired teenagers at adult wages. Suddenly, for the first time in American history, a significant number of young people had money to spend on things other than basic necessities. The economic opportunity alone wasn't enough to create the teenager as we know it. What happened next was a deliberate construction project, led by people like Eugene Gilbert, who recognized that this new demographic represented untapped commercial potential. Gilbert didn't just stumble onto teen marketing, he systematized it. In 1945, he founded Eugene Gilbert and Company, one of the first market research firms to focus specifically on teenage consumer behavior. His insights into this emerging market proved extremely valuable to businesses looking to tap into teenage spending power. Gilbert's key insight was that teenagers weren't just smaller adults. They constituted what he called a separate market with distinct preferences, communication patterns, and most crucially, a fierce desire to differentiate themselves from their parents. Gilbert understood that teenagers wanted products that would help them establish their own identity while distinguishing themselves from both children and adults. This wasn't just market research, it was the blueprint for manufacturing teenage identity itself. The media industry caught on quickly. In 1944, 17 magazine launched with the explicit goal of creating a teenage consumer culture. The magazine's approach was revolutionary. It treated teenage girls as a distinct market segment with their own purchasing power and preferences. Each issue of 17 contained more advertising than editorial content, and those ads weren't selling products so much as they were selling the idea that being a teenager meant consuming in specific ways. But the real genius of early teen marketing wasn't in the products themselves. It was in the emotions they promised to deliver. Advertisers quickly realized that teenagers were particularly susceptible to what psychologists now call identity marketing. Unlike adults who generally had an established sense of self, teenagers were actively constructing their identities. This made them ideal targets for products that promised not just utility, but transformation. The same marketing apparatus that created the teenager as a consumer category also manufactured teenage rebellion as a product to be sold. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. The key figure in this transformation was Dr. Robert Lindner, a psychiatrist whose 1944 book, Rebel Without a Cause, provided the psychological framework that marketers would later exploit. Lindner argued that modern teenagers weren't just rebelling against their parents, they were in active and hostile mutiny against society itself. But Lindner was describing a clinical condition, not celebrating it. He saw teenage rebellion as a symptom of social breakdown that needed to be addressed. Marketers read Lindner's work and saw something entirely different, a new emotional territory to colonize. If teenagers were naturally rebellious, then rebellion itself could become a product category. The trick was selling rebellion that looked dangerous but wasn't. Here's what they did. Rather than encouraging genuine rebellion against power structures, marketers created what we might call safe rebellion. Defiance that was dramatic enough to feel authentic but ultimately served corporate interests. The leather jacket became a symbol of rebellion, but it was manufactured by mainstream companies and sold in department stores. Rock and roll promised to overthrow the establishment, but it was distributed by major record labels owned by the same corporations that controlled everything else. Elvis Presley became the first teenager to be systematically marketed as a rebel. When Elvis burst onto the scene in 1954, his managers didn't just promote his music, they created an entire rebellious persona around him. But this rebellion was carefully calibrated. Elvis challenged sexual norms and racial boundaries in ways that felt revolutionary to teenagers, but he never questioned capitalism, consumerism, or the fundamental power structures of American society. His rebellion was purely cultural, never political. The Presley marketing machine was unprecedented in its scope. Unlike earlier teen idols like Frank Sinatra, whose appeal was largely limited to music, Elvis was positioned as a lifestyle brand. His name appeared on everything from clothing to cosmetics to jewelry. For the first time, teenage rebellion became a comprehensive consumer experience. This pattern would repeat throughout the 1950s and beyond. James Dean's image of tortured alienation was used to sell everything from jeans to cigarettes. Marlon Brando's motorcycle-riding tough guy persona became a template for marketing dangerous products to suburban kids who had never been in a real fight. Each of these figures represented rebellion, but it was rebellion as performance, rebellion as commodity. The genius of this system was its self-perpetuating nature. The more teenagers bought into the marketed version of rebellion, the more they needed to buy to maintain their rebellious identity. Rebellion became not just a phase you went through, but a lifestyle you purchased. And because fashion and music trends changed rapidly, teenagers had to constantly update their rebellious image, ensuring a steady stream of sales. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of commercialized rebellion was how it redefined authenticity itself. Genuine rebellion, the kind that actually challenges power structures, became almost impossible to distinguish from its marketed imitation. When every gesture of defiance was immediately co-opted and sold back to teenagers, authentic rebellion became nearly extinct. The long-term consequences of this commercialization extend far beyond the 1950s. What we're witnessing today is the logical endpoint of a process that began with Eugene Gilbert's observation about teenage consumer behavior. Teen rebellion has become so thoroughly commercialized that we can barely imagine what authentic teenage defiance might look like. Look at how this dynamic has evolved in the digital age. Social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram have created new mechanisms for manufacturing and monetizing teenage rebellion. The aesthetic trends that dominate these platforms, from dark academia to cottagecore to grunge revival, are essentially packaged rebellion experiences, complete with associated products and lifestyle brands. Each aesthetic promises to help teenagers express their authentic selves, but these expressions are algorithmically optimized and commercially driven. The rise of what marketers call AI-driven sentiment analysis has made this process even more sophisticated. Companies can now identify emerging youth trends in real time and develop products to capitalize on them before the trends fully develop. This means that teenage rebellion is increasingly being predicted, shaped, and monetized by artificial intelligence systems designed to maximize corporate profits. But there's an even deeper issue at stake. The commercialization of teen rebellion has fundamentally altered how we understand the transition from childhood to adulthood. In pre-consumer societies, this transition was marked by genuine rites of passage. ceremonies, responsibilities, and community recognition that signaled real change in social status. In our society, the transition has been replaced by consumption milestones. You become an adult not through meaningful experiences or acquired wisdom, but through purchasing the right products at the right time. This has created what sociologists call extended adolescence, a phenomenon where the markers of adulthood keep getting pushed further into the future. When rebellion becomes a consumer experience rather than a developmental phase, there's no natural endpoint. You can keep buying rebellion indefinitely, which means you can avoid the genuine challenges of growing up indefinitely. Think about what this means. We've created a society where the primary way young people learn to express dissatisfaction is through consumption. Instead of organizing, protesting, or creating alternative institutions, teenagers are encouraged to buy different products. This channels potentially transformative energy into harmless commercial activity. Yet there are signs that some young people are beginning to see through this system. The rise of movements like climate activism, which explicitly rejects consumer solutions to systemic problems, suggests that authentic rebellion might be making a comeback. When Greta Thunberg criticizes world leaders, she's not selling anything, and that's precisely what makes her message so powerful. The challenge for future generations will be learning to distinguish between genuine rebellion and its commercialized imitation. This requires developing what we might call commercial literacy, the ability to recognize when emotions and identities are being manufactured for profit. It means asking not just what do I want, but why do I want it, and who benefits from my wanting it. The next time you see a teenager in ripped jeans and a band t-shirt, remember that you're looking at the end result of an 80-year marketing campaign. That carefully cultivated look of rebellion represents one of the most successful examples of social engineering in human history, the transformation of natural adolescent defiance into a profitable consumer category. But once you see the machinery behind manufactured rebellion, it loses its power over you, and maybe that's where real rebellion begins, not in what you buy, but in refusing to let your identity be sold back to you by the very system you're supposedly rebelling against.